Good afternoon, and thank you for listening to WORT 89.9 FM listener-supported community radio in Madison, Wisconsin. It is now 12:05 p.m. on Tuesday, August 7th, and the show is A Public Affair. I am your host on Tuesday, Cynthia Lynn. I'm back from a month-long break from A Public Affair, and it's really great to be back in the station. I want to send out a really hearty thank you to the hosts that subbed in for me during the month of July. Anjali Misra, Stacy Harbaugh, Anjali Brecky, and Joanne Powers. I'm bringing you really powerful voices, really important discussions. So thank you very much to the really awesome team and extended community that WORT is at Community Radio. We have a wonderful guest joining us by phone today, Nicholas Hartlep. Nicholas is Assistant Professor of Educational Foundations at Illinois State University. He is author of a book titled Going Public, Critical Race Theory and Issues of Social Justice, and he is currently working on another book called The Model Minority Stereotype, Demystifying Asian American Success, which will be out in January 2013. We will be discussing with Nicholas issues in Asian American communities, the model minority myth and the realities it glosses over, how the Oak Creek shootings are being talked about, education and social justice, and transracial adoption, among other things. Nicholas Hartlep, welcome to A Public Affair.
Thanks for having me.
It's really great having you on. And listeners, the numbers to call in are 608-256-2001, or you can call toll-free at 866-899-WORT or 9678. And I also wanted to announce before we get into the discussion with Nicholas that tomorrow on A Public Affair, same time, same place on the radio dial, John Quinlan will be interviewing members of the local Madison Sikh community for a more in-depth discussion about reactions to the shootings and to discuss issues that are important to Sikh communities locally as well as globally. Nicholas, my first question for you is just if we could get a brief introduction to the model minority book that you're working on and talk about what the model minority myth is and why you think it's important to discuss it.
Definitely. So the model minority myth is a myth, among other things, that really implies that Asians in America are really successful. They may be successful educationally. They might be perceived to be athletically successful, as in with Jeremy Lin. They might be economically successful. But the problem with the model minority stereotype is it's false. And so the myth originated in the 60s. There was a sociologist, William Peterson, who wrote a New York Times Magazine article really saying that, look, the Japanese are really successful. And he went into a long discussion of indicators. And some of the indicators were criminal activity. So he said, they're really law-abiding. They're really quiet, and they work hard, and they don't ask questions. And so the myth began in the 60s, and then interestingly enough, it kind of transformed and was modified as decades passed. So it changed from being encompassing Japanese Americans to Chinese, and then slowly it became a catch-all for all Asians in America. A lot of the critical work of the book started because my dissertation work looked at the model minority stereotype, and a lot of the readings I read for the dissertation weren't being cited by people who were writing on the model minority stereotype. So the genesis of this book came about a personal interest as well as a professional interest of trying to put all of this scholarship in a book that other people could read. And so that's the story. And you mentioned in the introduction, Cynthia, about what the model minority stereotype glosses over. Interestingly enough, there's a term that academics use called ethnic loss. And the problem also that arises with the model minority stereotype, again, a stereotype or a myth, is that it implies success and it homogenizes all Asians. So it says, look, all of these Asians, you're really successful. You all go to UCLA, or you might go to Madison and in the Midwest, and you're taking over. The Asian invasion is taking over. and it homogenizes heterogeneity. So a term that folks use in academic circles is ethnic loss, which implies homogeneity when there's heterogeneity. Because we know the Asian American population is vast and heterogeneous. We know there's a lot of successful Asians, but we also know there's a lot of unsuccessful and folks, working in Chinatowns or in sweatshops, illegally or working illegally, in the black market. There's gang activity. There's undocumented Asian Americans, oftentimes Latinos. When we talk about undocumented immigration, it's issues of Mexicans coming across the border. But interesting enough, the DREAM Act really would benefit Asian Americans too, or Asians. So definitely, I think your introduction hit it head on. It hides a lot of problems.
Thank you. Listeners, if you are just tuning into A Public Affair now, I am Cynthia Lynn, your Tuesday host, and my guest this hour is Professor Nicholas Hartlep, talking with us about his book called The Model Minority Stereotype, Demystifying Asian American Success, and using that discussion as a point of departure for talking about critical issues that are affecting and shaping Asian American communities and how they're understood in the U.S. today. 608-256-2001 is the number to call if you're in the local area code. And join in on this conversation with your question or comment for Nicholas. You can also call toll-free at 866-899-WORT or 9678. Nicholas, thank you so much for the really great introduction and kind of scope of issues that we'll be talking about today. And before we dig a little bit deeper, I'd like to hear from you a little bit more about how these topics connect with and maybe emerge from your own stories and your own histories.
Yeah, definitely. So my name, Nicholas Hartlep, really, that's a very Anglo name, but truth be told, I am Asian American, or I call myself Korean. I was born in Seoul, South Korea, and adopted by my white adoptive parents. So I grew up in a transracial adoptive household, and interestingly enough, a lot of the work that is in this book intersects with experiences that I've had. And I'll give you a good example. With Jeremy Lin really hit the scene, and Linsanity was, sweeping the nation. A lot of issues came up about racism, and one was a headline ESPN, the website, put on "Chink in the Armor." And if you don't know why that's problematic, chink is a derogatory word used to disparage Asians, and so. Obviously, there was a metaphor. There was a problem with that title, but history repeats itself, as cliche as that may sound. And the Olympics are going on, and so I often wondered, back when Michelle Kwan was doing her Olympic Games, there was a headline similar that alluded to her not being American, when in fact she is American. Said something to the effect that beats the American beats the Asian, or something like that. So there's a lot of these headlines repeat, and so as a Asian adoptee, I was raised in predominantly white neighborhoods. I attended very much white schools, and so during my educational experience in high school, middle school, I would often hear things like, "Oh, chink," or "gook," or in high school, you drive those import cars, don't you? Like in Fast and the Furious, and so a lot of stereotypes abound. But interestingly enough, I was not very good. I was not very successful in high school or middle school. A lot of my teachers tried to counsel me out. I was taking a Spanish class. I remember a teacher said, "Nicholas, you should just give up on Spanish. You'll never learn the language." And so I really was never ascribed this model minority status, but I was ascribed a perpetual foreigner. They would say, where are you from? And say, Green Bay, Wisconsin. Oh, where are you really from? And they dig deeper. They wanted to hear somewhere Asian. And so a lot of the scholarship that's cited in this volume is talking about experiences that adolescents have with these stereotypes. And, personally, it's interesting, too. I do quantitative research. Mm-hmm. There's a stereotype that, all Asians are good at math. Just like Jeremy Lin, he graduated from Harvard, right, and with an economics degree. Mm-hmm. And so I was also a very thin and, I would say, just a very thin guy. I was, my dream was I could be taller and a little stronger while I was playing high school athletics. So a lot of these stereotypes impacted me throughout my experiences in schools and outside of schools. So that's kind of where why this project is a personal project. I'm learning a lot about myself as mm-hmm. well.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing pieces of your own story. And to go back to the concept of the myth itself, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why. What purposes does this myth serve? Why does it exist and persist?
Yeah, definitely. That's such a profound question, important. The myth, some people say, there's kind of two schools of thought. One would say the purpose serves, to maintain white supremacy, hegemony, the status quo. Mm-hmm. It emanated in the 60s. Well, we know what was going on in the 60s, civil rights struggles, African Americans' pursuit of freedom and justice. And so some would say that the model minority stereotype originated because American society needed a rhetorical device. They needed evidence that would support the notion that America was free and a meritocracy. Look, black people. Look, other people. Asians are really pulling themselves up from the bootstrap. Why? You're saying that it's all this racism, but look at these quiet, passive people. They're just working hard. And so that's one school of thought. The other school of thought would be that it's empirically valid, that Asians are, they're just successful. They're doing well. Their household income is high. All of these other indicators they use. Look at their getting into Ivy League schools and whatnot. But going back to the critical school, the other school of thought that said, look, this is a sham. Mm-hmm. It was manufactured to support white supremacy. They refute that, and they say, look, all of the indicators that you use and the methodology used to support your inferences are they're suspect. So they say, well, look, okay, you claim that Asians are they have a lot of money, they're doing well. Well, look at this data. Look at where Asians typically live. So they'll live in, California or cities that have high cost of living. And they say, yeah, it might appear like they're making a lot of money, but they live in areas where people do get paid more. And they also don't take into consideration the high the family composition. So there might be more heads under that roof. Mm-hmm. So they say, the critical folks, they say, look, you need to look at disaggregated data. And that goes back to the problem of homogenization. When we, as a country, say, look, Asians are doing well, well, what do you mean by Asians? Be more specific. Are you talking East Asian? Are you talking Chinese? Are you talking Japanese, Korean, Filipino? Are you talking South Asian? And so that's kind of the problem, Cynthia, that I see and other scholars see, that the homogenization really is a cause and consequence of the model minority stereotype. Mm-hmm.
This is Cynthia Lin, your Tuesday host of A Public Affair on WORT 89.9 FM Community Radio in Madison, Wisconsin. My guest this hour is Nicholas Hartlep, Assistant Professor of Educational Foundations at Illinois State University, and who is working currently on a book titled The Model Minority Stereotype, Demystifying Asian American Success. And he's talking with us about the model minority stereotype and critical issues that the stereotype on its face really hides and glosses over, as well as we're going to dig in deeper about issues that are facing Asian America currently in the U.S. 608-256-2001 is the number to call in. or toll free at 866-899-WORT. Nicholas, I really appreciate how you broke down kind of the emergence of the model minority stereotype as well as a critical perspective of it. And I often struggle with, where the empiricists that you talked about are at. And I asked you for a little bit of your story, so I'm going to say a little bit of mine because I think it really links in to this discussion. So because I think I've often struggled, as an East Asian woman born in the United States of Chinese descent, parents from Taiwan, that I am the profile of the false construct of what the model minority myth is about. My family came here and succeeded economically from having humble backgrounds, had access to very high quality public education as well as higher education, and I'm good at science and math and all those things. So I think as a person, as an individual whose story and whose personal story supports the false construct of the model minority myth, as well as somebody who seeks to trouble that and to work as an ally to other communities whose stories are maybe subsumed under this straw man or this false construct of the model minority myth. That's a piece of the story that I'm struggling to reconcile and really understand how my position connects. And I really appreciate the way that you talk about the reasons for the emergence as, and how it serves hegemony, how it serves ongoing white supremacy, as well as, opportunities to break away and erode away at it. And so I think my next question for you is, what does the myth hide? What does the myth elide? And what is important to remember about, the disaggregation and the heterogeneity that comprises Asian American communities?
Yeah, so what's really hidden by the myth is the ugliness. So suicide rates. It hides mental health disparities. It hides economic inequalities. Because, if the myth implies that everyone's successful, then, we're not going to observe or notice problems within this particular community, which leads to further marginalization. So a case in point would be, a halo effect going on. My background is a past teacher. And so if, as a teacher, I would assume that all my Asian students were doing really well, well, maybe I won't help them out as much because, they're going to be successful and they don't need my help. So there's scholarship that really looks at the overrepresentation of students of color in special education, particularly Latinos and African American students. But interestingly enough, the converse is Asian Americans being overrepresented in gifted and talented education. Now, I'm not saying that it's problematic that a kid maybe who is average level is in gifted and talented. What my problem is children, Asian Americans in particular, are not receiving the educational services that they need. I know that you interviewed Vijay Prashad, and he wrote in one of his books, he asked South Asians, how does it feel to be the answer? And W.E.B. Du Bois asked the question of his fellow man, how does it feel to be the problem? And so it's interesting how the myth hides the divide and conquer, strategy behind it. Because it's used in such a way that, look, Asians are really successful, blacks are not. And a lot of the work, recent work, it talks about this issue of affirmative action. So here's a good point. If Asian Americans are overrepresented, they're really successful at Ivy League schools, then there's an argument that says, look, they shouldn't be protected under affirmative action. And so there's a notion of negative action that scholars have coined, and it says this. It says, Asians, look, you need to move to a colorblind college admission process. It's a meritocracy. Affirmative action is hurting you, so they say. So it's trying to whiten Asian Americans and trying to treat them as, not as minorities, when in fact they are people of color. And so it's interesting, again, history repeats itself. Asians are not the first to be treated this way. Jewish people have been. And so it hides not only heterogeneity and divide and conquer, it also hides history. It hides the repetitious ways that history repeats itself. And so, as well as the mental health and all those other psychological issues in the community. So it's very insidious, as you can tell.
Mm-hmm. Nicholas Hartlep, we have a caller joining us. Caller, welcome to A Public Affair.
Oh, hi. Thanks for having me on. Wonderful show.
Thank you.
And I'm wondering, both of you had touched on your origin. I always find that fascinating, how it might play in. And could you go over quickly, like, the different countries? I know that a lot of Chinese come from the Canton area. And then where other Asians have come from. I know a lot of Indians came for school and stayed, and their kids are here now. And Japanese, if you could talk about that and how it might, play into what you're talking about, it would be really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, caller, for your question. Nicholas?
Yeah, definitely. So that call was really a great question. Thank you for asking that question. So, yeah, the model minority stereotype, earlier in the conversation, we talked about, who created it, and there's kind of two schools of thought, more critical and more conservative. Well, the critical folks would say, look, the 1960s, yes, civil rights was going on, but also, interesting enough, immigration laws changed. So 1965, immigration laws changed, which really permitted the influx of, opened the floodgates for Asians to come in to this country. And there's a lot of court cases, Sign Sin, and there's another court case where South Asians attempting to become racially white, become, perceived as white and not Oriental, and or whatnot. So to answer your question, Asians comprise a vast array. Pacific Islanders, interesting enough, there's a lot of scholarship where they'll say Asian Pacific Americans or API, Asian Pacific Islanders, or Hawaiian, Native Hawaiian. In the book, I only include research and scholarship that treats Asian Americans separately from Pacific Islanders, because there's a lot of research and scholarly discussions about that. Pacific Islanders, their history is a little different than Asians, and that they shouldn't be treated as Asians. But interesting enough, government, collects data in such a way that it's very difficult to just aggregate. So Asians come from, Japan, China, Philippines, and then also, to answer your question, Canton. There's different provinces. Canton was a large province. But it all really aligns with the immigration laws. And the immigration laws really favored highly educated Asians. So you have a problem, too, is, so do you count someone who had their PhD in China and then coming over? They're going to really kind of increase bias the sample. So there's a lot of Asians who are highly educated and come, but then also there's a lot of poorly or uneducated, formally that is. And so what scholars call that is a bimodal distribution. So if a normal curve is, up and down, Asian Americans, the population is considered bimodal. There's a lot in the high end, highly successful, and then there's a lot in the low end, under, that aren't as successful using those indexes. So immigration definitely has impacted the minority stereotype.
Mm-hmm. And Nicholas Hartlep, an Asian community that is very much on our minds and hearts today, this week, is the Sikh community. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time with you talking about these issues and questions, the critical ones that are facing Asian communities in U.S. contexts, that are really important to understanding the Oak Creek shooting that happened at a Sikh temple on Sunday. And I'm wondering, what are the things that are arising for you in intersection with the work that you do?
Yeah. So again, going back to who are we talking about when we say Asian American or Asian? And we know that it's a very diverse population. And so I think deep down in my heart, from all of the reading I've done and being an Asian American, the stereotype is that Asians are more Eastern looking. So you know, your eyes are slanted a little bit. You have dark black hair. You might be shorter. There's the stereotype of, you know, the rickshaw, you know, pusher in Chinatown. There's the stereotype of tattoos. You know, it's funny. Frank Wu, who wrote Yellow, in his book, he says, you know, whites, and I know I use this. I don't want to use this term too broad, but some white people, or even other people of color, they'll get tattoos, right? They'll get a tattoo of something in kanji or hangul or something, and you know, they don't know what it says. So they mark their body with this tattoo. It might say you're dumb or something, but they think it looks cool. Well, my question is, why does it look cool? You know, why is Asian culture appropriated? And so what's going on, what happened, and you know, our thoughts and prayers are with that community. Oak Creek was just south of where I was living for a time in Milwaukee. Is this? Are they Asian? Are they not Asian? Oftentimes, you know, they're perceived a lot. There's a misconception that they're Muslim and they're terrorists, right? Or they wear a turban, and they're not really. So when we say Asians, mental image comes to our mind, you know, Amy Chua, the Tiger Mom, you know, her picture. She's been all over the media. Jeremy Lin, maybe me for sure. If you saw me, you know, a Korean, I would. But the South Asians, perhaps no. Perhaps they're not. And we know that they've received oppression, South Asians in particular. The Dot Busters in New Jersey. The Dot Busters was this case where folks in New Jersey, white racists, were going around and publishing in the local newspaper that their pen name they signed was Dot Busters. And they said, we will kill... we'll basically kill you and beat you up. And they're referring to the dot on the forehead. And so there's a lot of, you know, very racist things about who mistaken identity, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. So who is Asian and who is not. And arguably the Sikh community is not perceived immediately as East Asians are.
Nicholas Hartlep, there's another kind of question about mistaken identity that has arisen in the midst of the media coverage about the Oak Creek shooting that I'd like to talk with you a little about. It leads us maybe a little bit further away from the central topic of your work about the model minority myth, but I think it's important in the context to discuss. I think there's been a lot of careful assertions in media coverage that Sikhs are not Muslims. And I think there's a lot of problematics behind, you know, and I think Vijay Prashad wrote an article saying that that leads to an assumption that that this was violence that was at the wrong address, I believe is the way that he talks about it, that because Muslims are understood as terrorists, then it would be otherwise justified for the Muslim communities. And there's all sorts of other problematics that are associated, that, you know, some from Islamophobia. And so a question that I have for you is that, you know, in the community of scholars and activists who are really working on debunking and demystifying the model minority myth, how, you know, does discourse about Islamophobia and critical discussion about that fit in?
Oh, it certainly does. The one strong, salient argument that I make is, so I've looked at the research for 4 decades, from the 60s on to the 2000s, and the same recurring patterns emerge, the same methodologies are used to debunk it, and I'm arguing that new paradigms are necessary. Intersectionality is necessary. And one thing that I find very problematic is, and why the model minority stereotype is so difficult to debunk and demystify, is you have Asian Americans with Asian names that maybe are successful, right? And they might actually be writing about the model minority stereotype. So they might say, look, Asian Americans are not all successful, yada, 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 but here is, I'm a graduate student at Harvard. or Frank Wu, he writes about it, but he is a very successful person. Mm-hmm. And so we need more rank and file folks that don't have credentials to, the grassroots. That's why I really value and really support your radio station, Cynthia. It's beautiful when it's coming from the community. And interestingly enough, Asian American movement was a middle-class endeavor. It was the college kids at Berkeley that really started Asian American, right, and then ethnic studies. And so new paradigms and activists need to start getting into this work. Going to your previous question about the implications for the Sikh community and the terrorism and stuff, yes, identity politics. It's why are they racialized as, in such a way? Who benefits from that racialization? The Cubono is like who benefits from the modus operandi, and right now I would say clearly it's not the Asian Americans. With the elections coming up, there's a lot of talk that Asian Americans are really going to sway the direction of this country due to their large growing population. And so the model minority stereotype really tries to curb their political advocacy and voice. So yeah, definitely.
I am Cynthia Lynn, your Tuesday host of A Public Affair on WORT 89.9 FM Community Radio in Madison, and my guest this hour is Nicholas Hartlep, Assistant Professor of Educational Foundations at Illinois State University, and he's talking with us about the model minority myth and other critical issues that are affecting and shaping the experiences of Asian communities in the U.S. 608-256-2001 is the number to call with your question or comment for Nicholas, or you can call toll-free at 866-899-WORT. We do have a caller waiting to join this conversation. Caller, welcome to A Public Affair.
Thank you. I wonder if your guest could comment on the myth of the people. In the United States, we talk about America, and America is simply a part of the North American continent, and the myth is that there is something called the American people. It seems to me anthropology and the study of linguistics has shown us that what we the people meant back in the 18th century was Anglo-Saxon, Frankish people of property who wanted to establish a property as the basis of wealth, not kingship or the kinds of programs found in Europe. And so when you speak of Asia or Africa, you're really talking about a multiplicity of tribes and families and dialects, and none of that is studied in our schools. So we are easy prey to the public relations, the corporations who want to form a people of propertied wealth. Could you comment, please?
Thank you, caller, very much for your question. Nicholas Hartlep.
Yeah, so I guess, Cynthia, did you, I didn't entirely grasp the question.
Sure, let me reframe it, for you and for the listeners. I think that the caller was really speaking to, you had a question about, who is understood in dominant culture with our cultural norms that maintain hegemony and white supremacy. So you talk about who belongs as Asian. And I think the caller's question was really, digging deeper in who is American, who gets to be American. And I think there are questions about also U.S. exceptionalism and, who really is of value, from the foundations of what we now understand as quote-unquote American society.
Okay, yeah, I understand now. Some Asians or Asian Americans, I am one of them. I consider myself Korean. I don't say Korean American. I don't say Asian American. And the reason why is because I don't feel like I'm part of America. E pluribus unum, out of many come one, this melting pot mentality. Well, we know who is being melted and who is under the fire melting that pot. Chinese, in particular, have been exploited. The Transcontinental Railroad was, created by their sweat and labor. Interestingly enough, their picture was never taken when the railroad was completed. The internment of Japanese in America, none of which were found guilty of committing a crime. Accusations of espionage. Wen Ho at laboratories saying that he's a spy. So the caller is absolutely right. Asian Americans is a pan-ethnic term that some people use, others don't. It gives us a vocabulary that we can at least talk about broadly in the book and elsewhere. It serves a function, right? And as well as stereotypes. Stereotyping serves a metacognitive function for people, taking a lot of diversity and coming up with a conclusion that, for the most part, people believe is true. Whether, that be all Hondas are bad cars or Chevys are the better cars, stereotypes do serve that function. So I understand that. But Asian Americans, you're absolutely right. They're coming from different lands, villages, languages, cultural traits. So the callers head on.
Nicholas Hartlep, we have about a little under 20 minutes left in the program. And I know we had talked about a break. I'm actually going to skip over that to make sure that we have space for the really important points that we have coming next. And I think I'd like to turn right now so you've given us a critical analysis of why the model minority myth and the impacts of kind of the root driving forces and motivations for this myth in ways that they shape Asian communities in American contexts. And I'd like to hear from you a little bit more about, what to do, the what to do question about what are the needs for, for ways that we can shift the analysis, shift the norms, shift the constructions of how people are understood and framed and talked about. And I know that you come from backgrounds as an educator, in K-12 context as well as in higher education, obviously. And maybe there are some insights from your work, in social justice, education, and pedagogies that will be helpful here.
Yeah, definitely. So, absolutely, that was a good intro, Cynthia. A lot in the education I'll mention. So one thing we know is Asian Americans are underrepresented in certain segments of the economy. So you won't find them as university presidents. Yeah, you'll find some, but they're underrepresented. You don't find them really in the leadership positions. So we know that that's called a glass ceiling. So a glass ceiling is a reality. It's not just perceived. It's real and it's there. So one thing that needs to be done is getting Asian Americans in these leadership positions, because the stereotype is Asian Americans can't lead. They're indecisive. They're passive. They don't have the wherewithal to lead a corporation or an institution or a school. So whether that be a principal, also Asian Americans are underrepresented in the schoolhouse. So as well as the state house. So we need politicians. We need Asian Americans to voice their concerns and needs for the community. In addition to those things, in the classroom, the implication is large. If you have Asian Americans and they're quiet, you need to understand why they're quiet and try to draw them and participate in culturally relevant ways. You need to understand issues of bilingualism and biculturalism. And I know that colleges of education are attempting to do this, but Asian Americans are a very invisible group because, for instance, in Milwaukee, it's an urban school district, and a lot of the talk when we say urban, it's referring to black students. And I'm not saying that the attention that was given. I'm not saying it's a zero-sum game, that what was given to blacks now needs to go to Asians, but Asians need to, by teachers, need to be perceived as students of color. And as a result of that, despite viewing them as students of color, they need to be looked at as, educational affirmative action. So, Hmong students, how many Hmong students are getting bachelor's degrees? What fields are they getting into? How can we increase the number of college preparation, college readiness? Not to say that everyone is college bound, but if they choose to, let's not have the excuse that, well, they can't afford it. So the structural impediments need to be ameliorated, and the model minority stereotype serves to just hide those, because if we don't think there's problems, then we won't see them. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the schools and society around those issues.
Nicholas Hartlep, in addition to working on the book that we've centered the conversation on today's A Public Affair around the model minority stereotype demystifying Asian American success, which is forthcoming in January 2013, you're also co-editing another volume on anti-racist education titled, as you told me earlier, Unhooking from Whiteness, which I think is an effort in a set of issues that warrants its own conversation. But I was wondering if you could highlight a couple of key insights or key concepts from that project about anti-racist education for our listeners today.
Sure. So Unhooking from Whiteness, the key to ending racism in the United States, really gets at the stories and voices of not only people of color, but white people. So through autoethnography and autobiography, the authors, the chapter contributors, write narratives about times or instances where they disrupted white supremacy. In my chapter, I address that as a transracial adoptee, I refuse to be a pawn for whiteness. And what I mean by that is going back to Prashad's idea of, being the solution. As a model minority, white supremacy would like me to distance myself from other oppressed and marginalized groups. And they would say, look, your hard work and dedication has paid off. Continue that, and you can become even more successful. And the Horatio Alger myth really is used to support this divide and conquer technique. So in my chapter, I look at my own walk, what I've done to help other friends of color, people of color, and disrupt and decenter whiteness. And other times, because in anti-racist education, oftentimes there's white people will feel guilty. Sometimes they feel guilty, and sometimes they feel empowered. But sometimes they'll feel guilty, and they say, like, well, as an ally, what does that look like? And so the argument that the chapter contributors really make in this volume is that as a white person, you have to really talk to your friends of color and say, when is a good time for me to leave? When is a good time for me not to leave? When's a good time that I can help you, give you my, give resources, take resources from my community, give them to you, and then so that can be used to gain more resources. So it's kind of a open dialogue, and that's how the book is really framed.
Mm-hmm. This is Cynthia Lin, your Tuesday host of A Public Affair on WORT 89.9 FM, listener-supported community radio in Madison, Wisconsin. And our guest this hour of the program is Nicholas Hartlep, Assistant Professor of Educational Foundations at Illinois State University. Nicholas, you earlier in the program when you were talking about how the discussion that we are having today connects and emerges from your own experience, and also just now when you're talking about your own story in as it shapes your anti-racist educational efforts, you mentioned the importance of identifying yourself as a transracial adoptee, and you've also written about transracial adoption kind of in conjunction with both of the sets of issues behind both of your book projects about mono-minority myth and Asianness in America, as well as racism and racial justice efforts in these contexts. Can you say a little bit more about the key issues that emerge from transracial adoption and what's important to you, especially, you've written kind of directly to audiences of parents that are thinking about or who are, engaging in adoption?
Yeah, definitely. So as an adoptee, if I'm out for dinner, an Asian American adoptee stands out like a sore thumb, right? So you have, and typically it's not always the case, but in most cases it's a white family. And so I immediately go up to that family and say, "Oh, I noticed that you've got an adopted child," and we talk, and I say, "Oh, I'm adopted too," and I tell them about my story. And you're right, I do tend to write for a parental audience, prospective adoptive parents, and I think that my perspective is going to be vastly different than the majority of potential adoptive parents. I view it as a form of colonization, because what you have is a situation where typically a child is adopted perhaps from China or Korea or another country that came from an impoverished family, a family that could not support that child. My family, my biological parents, they weren't married, and they were very poor. Interestingly enough, I went on a birth search, and I found my father last year. So I met my father numerous times now. I've been to Korea, and getting to know more about my history. And the conversation I've had with my biological father is that, yes, we were poor, we weren't married, and we thought it was best to give you up. So going back to the colonization point. So here you have impoverished families that perhaps can't provide for their child, so they will give their child up. And so now you have an issue of power, because it's very costly for an international adoption, very costly. And so issues arise like, well, Mom and Dad, why did you adopt an Asian boy? Why didn't you adopt domestically? Why didn't you adopt a white child? Why didn't you, adopt a black child? And so for me, I view it as an issue of human trafficking. I had no choice. I would prefer to stay with my family, right? Because I don't have the language. It's similar to Native Americans in this country. Language was stolen from them. They said, use English and think like us. So for me, it's difficult because culturally I'm white, being raised in a white milieu. But racially I'm identified, typically, somatically, I'm identified as an Asian. But yet I don't have the language or the culture necessary to navigate those spaces. So I'll go to a Korean festival, and someone will, see me and start talking to me in Korean. I'm like, no, I'm Korean, but I don't. You're Korean? You look Korean, but... And so those issues of identity confusion. And so for me, a lot of my writings pertain to empowerment. Mm-hmm. So, okay, if you want to adopt a kid from Korea, then it's going to require some things from you. It's going to require you that you learn Korean and you teach your child. It's going to require you to cook the food. It's going to require you to go out and buy a hanbok and have Korean friends. It's going to require, and I call this cultural citizenship. Mm-hmm. It requires that you get out of your comfort zone. My parents didn't even fly to Korea. They waited at the airport, and someone brought me out of the airplane and all that. So, these requirements are ludicrous. Parents need to go over there and understand. And the problem that I see is it becomes exoticism. So, oh, look, we're going to save this poor child and treat them like our own in a colorblind way. And, oh, no, Nicholas, they're calling you goof. Don't worry about it. They're just being jerks. They don't mean anything. Just ignore them. And so I believe in my heart that parents that want to adopt and current adoptive parents, they really need to just learn, and sometimes they need to just be quiet and listen to their child, and just say, wow, Nicholas, that's really hard. I don't know how that feels because I'm white. I don't know how it feels to be that way, and so it's a lot of interpersonal, intercultural communication that's necessary to bridge that gap. Because I view it as a lot of white families. I think that actor Jolie Gal, she's got like numerous children from other countries, and what irritates me, it's become a status symbol. It really has. Oh, well, we got our child from Honduras, and it becomes capital, and it's dinner time talk at fancy restaurants or whatnot. That's how I perceive it, and it shouldn't be that way. Definitely should not be that way.
Nicholas Hartlep, because a lot of, your insights and lessons to share are derived not only from your scholarship but also from your personal experience. And I hope I'm not prying too much, and feel free to bow out of this question if I am. But I'm curious about what doing this work and this writing, how has that affected your relationship with your own parents, especially, as maybe an example or, a set of lessons to learn from people who are working through the complexity of these relationships at the same time as attending to issues of power?
Yeah, Cynthia, you are a good radio host because you know how to lead these. That's a great question, and yeah, I feel comfortable to answer that. Interestingly enough, I'm in the midst of moving right now, and from Milwaukee. And I have my in-laws here, and who are white. My wife is white. And you're absolutely right. This work, even being on this radio show, really has put a lot of wind in my sails, and it's empowered me. So I'm really honored that I was allowed to talk. Being at family functions this summer with my in-laws and being the only person of color in the photos, right? It makes you feel different. Being adopted it's a very different perspective to have, and that's why when I have conversations with fellow CADs, we call them Korean adoptees, we talk the same language, so we can talk and we can vent. The stereotype of the angry Asian or the angry adoptee, that's me, right? Senses of abandonment, so relationship issues, all of those things have impacted me. Feeling neglected, feeling abandoned, like, oh, my parents gave me up. My parents got divorced, as a adolescent, as an 8-year-old. Oh, Mom, my adopted parents must not have loved me, or I did something wrong. And so a lot of inadequacy, a lot of pain, and certainly I think, my wife and I were talking. I would love to get a counselor, and when my wife and I talk about, oh, well, you should see a counselor. Okay, well, I've seen a counselor. They're all white guys and white girls, and I didn't like it. Maybe I should get a Korean, a Korean adoptee counselor. Maybe that would, and the perspective is different. My wife's like, well, it doesn't matter. They're all trained the same way. And it's at that moment that I know that her perspective departs from mine, because my epistemology, my way of reading the word in the world, as Paulo Freire and Donald Macedo say, it's completely different. And it really impacts the way I parent my children. My children are very color conscious. They understand that they're, half Korean, and I take it my responsibility to teach them about Korean culture as I learn it. And so you're absolutely right. It's an ongoing struggle, and it's not as idyllic and pretty as children's books have it. The children books about adoptee. Oh, well, you were picked up in the airplane and we all went home and it was happy ever after. Right. There's a lot of pain. So.
Thank you for sharing that, Nicholas Hartlep. And unfortunately, that's about all the time that we have in our program today. Nicholas Hartlep, thank you so much for being our guest on A Public Affair.
Thank you.
Nicholas Hartlep is Assistant Professor of Educational Foundations at Illinois State University, and he spoke with us about two book projects that he is currently working on: The Model Minority Stereotype, Demystifying Asian American Success, which will be released in January 2013, as well as an edited volume on anti-racist education titled Unhooking from Whiteness, due out April 2013.